The list of suspects narrows. Soon, there will be no one on the list but you.
Keep your babies close to you. There's someone out there.
You've just marked another milestone, another anniversary, 27 years since JonBenet's murder. What was that day like, and does it get any easier?
No, we miss her every day, and it was, we had difficulty for several years celebrating Christmas. We couldn't do it. We couldn't put up a Christmas tree and celebrate, and we just couldn't do it. So that was a difficult period of time for us for a long time.
Was that the same for you, John Andrew? Because it's usually a very happy time of year, and in your family it became a very traumatic time of year.
Right, and I think it's important to keep in mind what JonBenet would want, right? Yeah. And it would to be celebrating with family and happy and enjoying the moment. But yeah, it's always in the back of your mind, you know, what happened that day 27 years ago, and what happened to her.
You know, that's a good point. My oldest daughter, Beth, was killed in a car accident several years before we lost JonBenet. And at her funeral, one of her little friends came up, and she was 21, had just graduated from college, and said, you know, Mr. Ramsey, if I died, I would not want my parents to be sad. And that was very impactful to me. That I know Beth wouldn't have wanted me to be sad. JonBenet wouldn't want us to be sad. And it just helps to have that perspective a little bit.
That's a good point, because you've said before she was a very happy little girl.
Oh,
what was she like?
Yeah, she I remember one time I came home from work, and I guess I must have had a frowning face. And she said, Dad, I don't like that face. And I put on kind of a fake smile and said, that's better. And she was probably 4 years old, you know, so we called her the up girl. And that came from, the kids would always run up to an elevator and kind of try to get one would try to get for there first to push the button. So we said, okay, let's fix this. Burke, you push the down button. JonBenet, you push the up button. Okay, that'll work. And so she became the up girl.
Glass half full.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you think it is that we're sitting here 27 years on and no one has yet been hit?
Patsy, and I remember Patsy saying that your lives could not go on until the killer was found.
Well,
how much weight was that on Patsy before she died?
Patsy was a very strong woman. She really was, and a very kind person, a wonderful mother. She got pretty vilified in the media, which was horribly unfair. I think hurt deeper than it showed. If the police will take advantage of all the technology that's available to them, and that's going to one or two of the world's cutting-edge labs for DNA testing. And I think if they do that, and if we're successful getting a sample in the right format and then do the genealogy research, I'm 80% confident it can be solved. But you got to do it.
We have thoroughly investigated multiple people identified as suspects throughout the years, and we continue to be open-minded about what occurred as we investigate the tips that come in to detectives.
We were casual with our security in our home in Boulder. We thought it was a safe place. And we got casual and complacent.
When you look back, are there any things you wish you had done differently?
The little beauty pageants they participated in, and I wouldn't have done that. You need to keep your children private. It was conflict for me because Patsy had just recovered from stage 4 ovarian cancer, was grateful to have some life ahead of her.
When people hear the word DNA, they imagine certainty science that doesn't lie. But in the JonBenet Ramsey case, DNA has never been that solid. To understand why, we need to walk back to the very beginning, to December 1996, when investigators first collected those microscopic samples that would later become the centerpiece of decades of argument in the basement of the Ramsey home. Alongside the body of a 6-year-old, crime scene technicians gathered trace material from her clothing and from beneath her fingernails. What they found was so small that even in the most advanced laboratories of the time, it could barely be tested. These fragments weren't full genetic profiles. They were broken, partial, degraded. Instead of giving investigators a clear suspect, they gave them ambiguity just enough to spark speculation, but never enough to hold up in court. Back in the mid-90s, DNA science was still in its adolescence. Laboratories required larger samples to run reliable analysis. What Boulder police had was nothing, tiny cells clinging to fabric, a few fragments stuck under nails. The tests produced incomplete sequences. That meant no full match could be made, no official profile entered into CODIS, the federal DNA database. Detectives were left with the phrase unknown male contributor, which sounded promising but in reality meant very little. By 2003, technology had improved. New methods allowed scientists to retest the original swabs with greater sensitivity. The result? The same answer: there was DNA, but it did not belong to John, Patsy, or Burke Ramsey. For many in the media, that was enough. They leapt to the conclusion that this mystery male proved an intruder was responsible. But science doesn't work by elimination. Just because the fragments didn't belong to a family member does not mean a stranger committed the crime. It simply means the sample was not theirs. That's a critical distinction often ignored in headline-driven coverage. In 2008, another round of testing was carried out with even newer technology. This time, touch DNA analysis used methods capable of extracting profiles from cells left behind by the briefest contact. Once again, the findings showed an unidentified male. And once again, Boulder's district attorney at the time, Mary Lacey, publicly declared that the Ramsey family was cleared. She used those results as the basis for what sounded like exoneration, but experts quickly pushed back. James Kolar, who served as an investigator for the district attorney's office, wrote later in his book Foreign Faction that the reliance on such trace material was misguided. He explained that clothing manufactured in large facilities can easily carry genetic residue from factory workers, packagers, even store employees. That means the DNA could have been present before JonBenet ever wore the garments. According to Kolar, staking an entire conclusion on that kind of evidence was reckless. Candice DeLong, former FBI profiler, also raised concerns. She pointed out that in every major child homicide she had studied, investigators needed a confluence of evidence, behavioral patterns, physical proof, eyewitness testimony, not just a microscopic genetic trace. In her words, treating these broken fragments as the golden ticket was a dangerous shortcut. Other former FBI agents echoed the same warning. They highlighted how low copy number DNA, the kind generated from tiny samples, was notoriously vulnerable to contamination. A cough in the lab, a touch by a gloved hand that had previously handled another item, even the simple act of packaging clothing decades ago could leave behind foreign cells. Once amplified in a modern machine, those stray cells can appear significant even when they're not. So let's connect this back to the bold claim that the case is solved. For 30 years, every attempt to squeeze answers out of those fragments has led to the same dead end. It isn't the family, but it isn't identifiable either. No arrests, no charges, no courtroom arguments, because science has never crossed the threshold of certainty. What we have is not a suspect. What we have is a shadow, a faint trace that could have come from almost anyone who ever brushed against JonBenet's clothing. The truth is, DNA in this case has always been more of a story device than a legal weapon. It was convenient for television specials, for prosecutors looking to calm public outrage, and for commentators eager to say the family was innocent or guilty. But scientifically, it has never been the smoking gun. It is, in fact, the weakest brick in a wall already full of cracks. And that's why any video claiming those fragments have finally exposed the killer should immediately be met with skepticism. Because if 30 years of testing 1996, 2003, 2008 couldn't produce a clear identity, what changed now? The answer isn't science. The answer is the narrative, and narratives don't put killers in prison. Evidence does. If DNA was supposed to be the holy grail in JonBenet's case, then touch DNA became the last straw prosecutors and storytellers clung to. But this branch of forensics is built on shaky ground. Let's cut through the glamour and look at the science for what it really is. Touch DNA, what it sounds like: tiny cellular traces left when skin brushes against a surface. It could be a sleeve brushing fabric, a hand moving a toy, a store clerk folding new clothing. We're talking about the smallest possible fragments, 5, 10, maybe 20 cells. Modern machines can amplify that microscopic residue into a genetic profile. But just because you can build a profile doesn't mean it belongs to the killer. That leap from presence to guilt is the central flaw. Think about JonBenet's case specifically. Her clothing was manufactured in bulk, handled by workers, packaged, shipped, stacked on retail shelves. At any one of those points, stray cells could have adhered to the fabric. That's not speculation, it's a documented reality. In 2007, studies from European labs revealed brand new, unworn garments often carried foreign DNA from factory employees. In other words, even before a child ever wears her pajamas, she could already be carrying around someone else's genetic trace. This matters because the prosecution narrative leans heavily on the idea that unknown male DNA equals intruder. But what if that unknown male never set foot inside the Ramsey home? What if he was a factory worker in North Carolina or Taiwan? What if he was the stock boy who unpacked boxes at a Boulder department store? Suddenly, the miracle evidence becomes meaningless. Real-world cases reinforce this danger. In 2011, German police chased a phantom female suspect for over a decade, the so-called woman without a face. Her DNA appeared at dozens of crime scenes, burglaries, homicides, assaults. It turned out the cotton swabs used to collect samples at the crime scenes were contaminated at the factory by a single worker. Years of investigations, millions of euros wasted, all because low-level DNA was misinterpreted. That scandal should be a warning. Microscopic traces can mislead entire nations, let alone one fractured police department. Now add to that the chaos inside the Ramsey home on December 26, 1996. Officers didn't secure the property as a crime scene. Friends, neighbors, even a pastor walked in and out freely. People sat in the kitchen, wandered the halls, touched doors and surfaces. When the father carried the child's body upstairs, he disrupted whatever fragile clues might have remained. In forensic terms, the chain of custody was shattered before it ever began. From that moment forward, every swab, every fiber, every cell collected from that house was already tainted by uncontrolled handling. Chain of custody means the unbroken record of who collected evidence, how it was packaged, where it was stored, and how it was transferred to labs. In Boulder, that record looked like Swiss cheese. Items were boxed incorrectly, moved from one place to another without documentation, left vulnerable to secondary transfer. Even trained officers later admitted they had no idea how many people had touched key pieces of evidence. Once you lose control of your evidence, you lose your science. And in court, you lose your case. Consider how forensic science is supposed to work. A bullet pulled from a victim's body is logged, sealed, and tracked meticulously. A bloody knife is bagged, labeled, and locked in storage. Every signature on every line ensures authenticity. But with JonBenet, clothing that should have been sealed was handled and rehandled. Objects in the basement were shifted around. Some items, like the rope and tape, were never tested at all. So when you later amplify a microscopic fragment of DNA, how do you know whether it came from the perpetrator, from a family friend, or from a technician who leaned too close to the evidence table? The short answer: you don't. And this is the heart of the problem with elevating touch DNA as if it were the voice of God. It isn't. It's fragile, it's easily misinterpreted, and it's highly prone to contamination. The longer evidence sits, the more times it's opened, the greater the risk that what you're measuring is noise, not truth. So when a video confidently declares, the killer has been identified, remember what we've just walked through. Remember that these so-called profiles can originate from a factory worker's sweat, a detective's breath, or a lab technician's careless touch. Remember that the Boulder Police Department allowed the most critical chain of custody in American true crime history to collapse before the first day was over. This isn't about proving innocence or guilt of the Ramseys. This is about understanding that the science being paraded as conclusive is, in fact, riddled with holes. And if the foundation is unstable, everything built on top of it, every accusation, every YouTube headline comes crashing down. Here's the blunt reality: the DNA tied to JonBenet's case would never stand unchallenged in a courtroom. Not then, not now. Courts demand reliability, and reliability comes from three things: sample quality, integrity of handling, and reproducibility of results. On all three counts, the material from this crime scene collapses. First, sample quality. What was collected in 1996 wasn't a full genetic profile. It was a scatter of weak, broken sequences pulled from clothing and fingernails. A robust forensic sample should produce a complete profile across multiple loci, the standard markers used worldwide for identification. These fragments didn't. They were partial, degraded, and incapable of placing any one person beyond a reasonable doubt. In legal terms, that means not probative. The law doesn't allow lives to be ruined on fragments that could match millions. Second, integrity of handling. Chain of custody is sacred in evidence law. Every touch, every transfer, every storage condition must be documented with precision. In Boulder, that discipline was absent from day one. The house was open to friends, clergy, even neighbors before it was locked down. Objects were shifted, evidence moved without logs. When the father carried his daughter's body upstairs, he unknowingly broke the most critical barrier between a controlled scene and contamination. Any defense attorney worth their license would shred such evidence within minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, this DNA could have come from anyone: visitor, paramedic, even the investigator himself. And the jury would nod, because they'd be right. Third, reproducibility. In science, results must be consistent across tests and labs, but low-level, so-called touch DNA is notoriously unstable. Sometimes it appears, sometimes it vanishes. The same swab tested twice can yield different results. Courts are wary of this. Judges have thrown out low copy number DNA in other cases precisely because it fails the standard of reproducibility. If the test can't produce the same outcome every time, it cannot form the basis of a conviction. Legal precedent reinforces this. In the UK, entire prosecutions collapsed when defense teams exposed the unreliability of traced DNA. In Germany, the infamous phantom suspect fiasco revealed how contaminated swabs led investigators down a decade-long dead end. These weren't fringe mistakes, they were systemic failures that forced courts to admit the limits of science. If those cases couldn't survive scrutiny, why would Boulder's fragmentary DNA? And here's the key, the burden of proof in criminal law is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not a slogan, it's the highest standard in our justice system. It means jurors must be convinced to a moral certainty. Partial strands that might belong to a factory worker, or a store clerk, or a medic leaning too close during resuscitation attempts cannot meet the threshold. They create doubt by their very existence. So when a YouTube video claims the killer has been identified, it's selling certainty that doesn't exist in law. If prosecutors walked into a courtroom tomorrow with only these fragments in hand, the defense would dismantle them line by line. Judges would exclude them or instruct jurors to treat them with caution. And the case would fall apart, just as it has for almost 30 years. That's the bridge between science and justice. Evidence must not only look convincing under a microscope, it must survive cross-examination under oath. In JonBenet's case, this DNA never could. It's not the key to the mystery, it's the weakest link in the file. We've already seen how the supposed DNA in JonBenet's case fails the test of quality, integrity, and legal admissibility. But in recent years, there's been a new wave of enthusiasm in the true crime world, something called genetic genealogy. The moment that phrase appears, people imagine miracles. They picture detectives solving cases long thought impossible. They hear about the Golden State Killer and think every cold case can be cracked the same way. But that is where hype collides with reality. Let's slow this down. Genetic genealogy works by building family trees from DNA submitted to consumer databases. Companies like GeneMatch and FamilyTreeDA allow ordinary people to upload their profiles to learn about ancestry. Investigators, when permitted, can compare crime scene DNA to these databases. If they find a partial match, say, a second cousin, they can begin building backwards, mapping out generations until they zero in on a suspect. That's how Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, was identified. It was a stunning success. But here's the crucial difference in that case, the DNA was robust. The crime scenes had yielded high-quality samples preserved across decades. Full profiles could be uploaded and compared. Investigators had enough material to construct family trees with precision. That's why it worked. Now compare that to JonBenet's case. What do we have? A handful of fragile fragments, low-level sequences pulled from fabric and nails, incomplete and degraded. You cannot build a family tree out of scraps. You cannot populate a genealogy chart from partial strands that might not even come from the perpetrator. The technology simply does not allow it. Parabon Nanolabs, the private company often touted in stories like this, has done remarkable work, but it cannot conjure a full genetic identity from unreliable debris. The data just isn't there. Yet the video insists otherwise. It paints a picture of detectives quietly partnering with Parabon, uploading the so-called profile, and magically tracing it to a 62-year-old man who once lived 2 miles from the Ramsey home. Sounds dramatic. Sounds like closure. But ask yourself, if that were true, where is the press conference? Where are the court documents? Where is the arrest warrant? Law enforcement agencies in America never sit silently after solving one of the most infamous child homicides in history. They announce it, they parade it, they take credit. Here, there is nothing. Just a YouTube script. That silence is telling. It means no official body is standing behind this claim. It means the story is being spun not in court filings, but in clicks and views. And when you strip away the dramatic language, what you're left with is not forensic science, but entertainment. Let's examine how storytelling distorts perception. The narrative says unknown male DNA, Parabon genealogy, a forgotten neighbor. Finally exposed, the rhythm is intoxicating. It delivers a villain just in time for the audience's need for resolution. But resolution in a video is not the same as resolution in justice. Resolution in a script does not require admissible evidence. It requires only good hook, a cliffhanger, and a share button. And this is where media motives come into play. True crime has become an industry massive, profitable, and competitive. Channels compete for subscribers the way tabloids once fought for headlines. What cuts through the noise? Not careful forensic debate. What sells is certainty. Mystery solved. DNA cracked the case. The killer finally unmasked. Those phrases guarantee views. They turn tragedy into marketable content. Think of it from a content creator's perspective. A title that says the DNA evidence remains unclear doesn't spread. A headline that admits case still unsolved doesn't trend. But a bold declaration mystery finally solved that hooks an audience. accuracy becomes secondary. The algorithm rewards drama, not restraint, and families still grieving are left caught in the wake of sensationalism. It's important to remind ourselves that genealogy is not magic, it's a tool. It works only when the foundation DNA is clear, strong, and properly handled. In JonBenet's case, the foundation was crumbling from day one. Any claims that genealogy could resurrect it are, at best, wishful thinking, at worst, deliberate deception. Let's bring this into sharper focus. Suppose for a moment that a 62-year-old neighbor truly had been identified. What would investigators have done? They'd have followed procedure. They'd surveil him, gather discarded items like coffee cups or cigarette butts, test those against the original crime scene DNA. If it matched, they'd move toward arrest. The district attorney would then file charges. The case would enter the court system. Every step would be documented, every record available through public filings. None of that has happened. Instead, the claim lives only in a video script. That should tell you everything. Another angle worth exploring is how these claims exploit public memory of successful cases. When audiences hear Parabon, they immediately think of Golden State Killer. They assume the same miracle has occurred here. But equating the two is like comparing a lighthouse beam to a flickering candle. One illuminated entire coastlines, the other barely lights a corner of the room. And yet, the video stitches those associations together deliberately. It doesn't need the audience to understand the nuances of loci, allele dropouts, or stochastic effects in low-copy DNA. It just needs to feel the connection Golden State Killer solved with genealogy. JonBenet solved the same problem. That emotional shortcut is marketing, not science. So let's say this clearly no credible evidence exists that genealogy has broken the Ramsey case. No police department has verified it. No court has filed it. No jury has weighed it. What we have is a story dressed up as revelation. It's compelling to watch, easy to share, but worthless in the pursuit of justice. And that leads us to the hardest truth. True crime media doesn't always serve the truth. Sometimes it serves demand. Demand for closure. Demand for villains. Demand for certainty where none exists. In JonBenet's case, that demand has become a business model. When you strip away the polish, what remains is exploitation of grief. A little girl's death recycled for engagement. Her image, her name, her tragedy turned into currency. And each time someone clicks believing the words mystery solved, the deeper reality slips further out of reach. So where do we stand now? We stand in the shadow of a case still unsolved, still corrupted by early mistakes, still unresolved by science. Genealogy has worked miracles elsewhere, but not here. And until we see hard evidence presented in a courtroom, not in a video, claims of closure are nothing more than narrative smoke. The mystery of JonBenét Ramsey is not solved. It is still open, still haunting, and still demanding honesty. And honesty begins by calling these grand pronouncements what they are: exaggerations designed not to deliver justice, but to capture attention. Start with the most bizarre piece of evidence in the entire case, the ransom note. 2.5 pages long. Written on paper torn from Patsy Ramsey's own notepad, using her family's own pen. No kidnapper in criminal history has ever lingered in Saictem's home to draft a manifesto of that length. Real kidnappers minimize risk. They leave a few words, a short demand, maybe a phone number. But here we have a theatrical document full of unnecessary details and composed in a safe environment, the Ramsey house itself. The amount demanded makes the note even stranger: $118,000. That's not a round figure. That's not the kind of ransom number criminals pull out of thin air. That number happened to be the exact amount of John Ramsey's Christmas bonus from Access Graphics. How could a stranger know that? Unless they had inside access to John's payroll. The detail seems almost impossibly specific. Which raises the obvious question: was the note written not by an outsider, but by someone inside, someone with intimate knowledge of the family's finances? And then there's the silence that followed. A ransom note implies communication. A phone call, a follow-up, an instruction on where to drop the money. None of that ever happened. The supposed kidnappers never reached out. No negotiations, no directions, nothing. The note promised a kidnapping scenario, but the child never left the house. The entire narrative collapsed the moment her body was discovered in the basement. Which forces us to confront the uncomforted stomach. That means she ate some within hours of her death. Now here's the problem. Both John and Patsy swore they never served her pineapple that night. They said she was asleep when they returned from the party. They claimed they put her straight to bed. But the fingerprints don't lie. Patsy's prints were found on the bowl. Burke's DNA appeared on the spoon. And yet, both denied feeding her. That inconsistency is haunting, because it suggests either memory gaps or deliberate deception. If JonBenet was awake enough to eat pineapple, then the parents' timeline is wrong. If Burke was involved in the late-night snack, then his role that evening is greater than admitted. And if Patsy handled the bowl, then her denial undermines her credibility. Why does this matter? Because the pineapple timeline narrows the window of events. It shows the child was awake when the family insisted she wasn't. It ties the kitchen scene to her final hours. And it directly contradicts sworn statements. Once again, the DNA fragment. Then we come to the errors of that morning. Any homicide investigator will tell you the first hours are sacred. You lock down the location. You freeze movement. You protect evidence like treasure. None of that happened in Boulder. When Patsy dialed 911, police arrived but treated the case as a kidnapping, not a homicide. They restricted only the bedroom. The rest of the house remained open. Friends streamed in to comfort the Ramseys. A pastor entered. Neighbors walked through. Coffee was served in the kitchen. People sat on furniture, touched surfaces, and contaminated every corner of the supposed crime scene. And then, the most critical error of all, John Ramsey himself was allowed to roam. He went to the basement, found his daughter's body, and carried her upstairs in his arms. In that moment, every piece of forensic evidence on her body and around her was compromised. Fibers, fluids, trace material all disrupted by the embrace of a grieving father. To this day, we cannot know what was original and what was transferred in that act. The scene was ruined before forensic specialists even arrived. And yet the video skips past this chaos, as if DNA collected later could somehow override the contamination. But science doesn't work that way. Once a scene is corrupted, it stays corrupted. Finally, let's talk about the family's conduct. Much of what keeps this case alive isn't just evidence, it's how the Ramseys acted in the aftermath. From the beginning, John and Patsy resisted separate interviews. They insisted on being questioned together. That violates standard procedure. Investigators want independent statements to catch inconsistencies. The Ramseys delayed cooperation, hired attorneys quickly, and limited access. For grieving parents desperate to find a child's killer, such behavior struck many observers as defensive. Then there's Burke. At just 9 years old, his role was ambiguous. He was said to be an alone call, where some experts claim faint background voices can be heard after she thought she had hung up. Voices possibly belonging to Burke and John, contradicting the idea that Burke was asleep. Though disputed, it's another strand of doubt in a case already tangled. Put all this together: the bizarre ransom note, the pineapple contradictions, the contaminated scene, the family's evasive behavior, and ask yourself, can microscopic DNA fragments erase all of it? Can a partial profile of uncertain origin sweep aside hours of inconsistencies and decades of suspicion? Of course not. This is why clinging to DNA as the final answer is not just scientifically weak, it's intellectually dishonest. It ignores the evidence that refuses to conform to a simple narrative. It bypasses the questions the family never answered. It discards the mistakes the police made that morning. And it silences the objects that still speak: a note written on Patsy's paper, a fruit bowl touched by Patsy's hands, a basement scene altered by John. The YouTube video wants closure. It wants the word solved stamped across a tragedy that still bleeds uncertainty. But closure cannot come from ignoring contradictions. It cannot come from cherry-picking evidence that fits an intruder fantasy while discarding everything else. The ransom note still mocks us with its absurdity. The pineapple bowl still whispers of a late-night kitchen scene. The corrupted crime scene still warns us of lost truth, and the family's guarded behavior still raises eyebrows decades later. None of that disappears because of a few genetic fragments. So the next time you hear the phrase "mystery finally solved," remember the evidence the storytellers left out. Because often, what's missing is more revealing than what's shown. In the courtroom, truth is never just about science. It's about how science collides of law with politics, with public perception. And nowhere is that collision more obvious than in what happened after JonBenet's death. If the ransom note, the pineapple bowl, and the chaos at the crime scene left investigators drowning in contradictions, then the courtroom battles and prosecutorial decisions showed how fractured the system became when forced to act on flimsy evidence. Let's rewind to 1999, 3 years after the crime. A grand jury in Boulder was convened to review evidence. Grand juries don't decide guilt. They decide whether there is enough probable cause to indict, enough evidence to formally charge someone with a crime. The threshold is far lower than beyond a reasonable doubt. And here's the bombshell: after reviewing months of testimony, exhibits, and forensic reports, that jury voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death and being accessories after the fact. That decision didn't mean the jury thought the Ramseys murdered their daughter outright. But it did mean they believed there was sufficient reason to suspect parental involvement, either in causing her fatal injuries or in staging the aftermath. That vote was historic. It demonstrated that a panel of citizens, hearing the evidence in private, believed the case against the parents was strong enough to pursue in court. And yet, no trial followed. Why? Because the district was from powerful allies of the Ramseys. from local officials worried about Boulder's image, and from national media that had already painted the family as victims of police incompetence. By refusing to proceed, Hunter effectively overruled the will of the jury. And for the next decade, the indictment itself remained sealed, hidden from the public. It wasn't until 2013, 14 years later, that the documents were finally released, confirming what had long been rumored. The grand jury wanted charges, but the DA said no. That moment revealed a critical truth. The legal system had evidence strong enough to warrant charges against the parents, but prosecutorial discretion shielded them. It wasn't a scientific exoneration. It was a political calculation. Fast forward to 2008. A new district attorney, Mary Lacey, made headlines when she publicly declared the Ramseys innocent. She issued a formal statement clearing them of suspicion, basing her conclusion almost entirely on DNA analysis conducted with updated methods. The tests once again showed unidentified male DNA on JonBenet's clothing. Lacey took that as definitive proof that an intruder was responsible. She apologized to the family for years of suspicion and vowed they were no longer under the cloud of accusation. On the surface, it looked like vindication. But beneath the headlines, experts bristled. Former investigators, forensic scientists, even FBI profilers criticized the decision. Why? Because they knew the DNA wasn't reliable enough to exclude other possibilities. They knew trace samples can be misleading. They knew that absence of family DNA is not proof of innocence. And they knew that declaring certainty in such a murky case was reckless. James Kolar, who worked in the district attorney's office before publishing Foreign Faction, blasted Lacey's move as irresponsible. He argued that she elevated weak science into a shield that erased other lines of inquiry. Candace DeLong, a veteran FBI profiler, voiced the same concern. Lacey's proclamation was not based on a holistic review of the case, but on a single, shaky strand of evidence. It was more than a mistake, it was a message. By exonerating the Ramseys publicly, Lacey shifted the narrative from ambiguity to absolution. She turned a disputed piece of science into a political tool. And in doing so, she polarized the case further. Those who believed in family involvement felt silenced, those who believed in an intruder felt emboldened, and the possibility of balanced inquiry was lost. This is where the abuse of DNA as a legal device becomes clear. In 1999, the grand jury found probable cause against the parents. In 2008, the DA used DNA to proclaim their innocence. The same evidence file produced two opposite outcomes, depending on who controlled the narrative. That contradiction alone proves that the DNA was never definitive. DNA in JonBenet's case has been wielded like a political sword, cutting one way when prosecutors feared losing, cutting the other when they sought to rehabilitate reputations. Neither move was grounded in unshakable science. Both were grounded in strategy. And that is the tragedy. Instead of being used as a tool of truth, DNA was used as a tool of convenience. Law demands consistency. If evidence is solid, it's shifting prosecutors, changing climates, or political winds. But in this case, the evidence bent and twisted depending on who held office. That's not science. That's spin. The implications are enormous. It means that for decades, the Ramsey case has been less about solving a homicide and more about managing narratives. One prosecutor overrode a jury to avoid the spectacle of a trial. Another prosecutor declared the family innocent to escape pressure and embarrassment. In both instances, the decision wasn't rooted in irrefutable proof, but in damage control. And that brings us full circle to the YouTube video claiming mystery finally solved. Because what it's doing is nothing new. It's echoing the same misuse of DNA we've seen for years, transforming uncertainty into absolution, using fragile fragments as shields to protect preferred narratives. The video may not be a district attorney's office, but it's playing the same game, telling a story people want to hear, regardless of whether the evidence can stand in court. The grand jury's vote in 1999 and Mary Lacey's declaration in 2008 are not contradictions to be ignored. They are proof of how unstable the case has always been. They reveal that justice has been steered not by solid evidence, but by human decisions influenced by politics, fear, and the hunger for closure. So when you see DNA held up as the final word, remember this history. Remember the jury that believed there was enough evidence to charge. Remember the prosecutor who said no. Remember the DA who later declared innocence on the flimsiest scientific grounds. And remember that truth does not bend with political convenience. The reality is stark. JonBenet's case remains unsolved not because it lacks evidence, but because the evidence has been twisted, muffled, and selectively deployed. DNA, far from solving the mystery, has been weaponized to obscure it. When the video runs out of DNA claims, it pivots to something else, another disturbing crime in Boulder. Less than a year after JonBenet's death, a young girl, asleep in her own bed, attacked by a stranger who slipped into her home. The details sound chilling, and the proximity to the Ramsey neighborhood seems impossible to ignore. The implication is clear: if another little girl was assaulted nearby, then surely the same predator was responsible for JonBenet. but the implication is not evidence. And that distinction is critical. According to records, 9 months after the Ramsey case, an intruder entered the home of a child living only a few blocks away. He crept into the bedroom while she slept. The mother awoke, startled by noises, and actually glimpsed the man before he fled. In his rush, he leapt off a balcony to escape into the night. Terrifying. Absolutely. Close to the Ramsey home. Yes, connected. That's the leap the video makes, and it's a leap unsupported by any hard science. The truth is, nothing in the transfer of fibers, identical tool marks, consistent offender behavior patterns. None of that exists between the two Boulder incidents. The video collapses that nuance. It waves the second attack like a banner. See, the predator was still out there. But without corroborating evidence, it's only a story. Worse, it risks turning one tragedy into a prop for another. Folding two separate unsolved crimes into a single narrative without justification. Now, it is true that Boulder police botched the second case badly as the first. Critical items, like the bedsheets from the child's room, were thrown away instead of preserved. Those sheets could have contained hairs, fluids, or fibers that might have identified the attacker. By discarding them, officers robbed fugators of potential answers. This was a repeat of the same incompetence that marred JonBenet's case, mishandling evidence, underestimating the crime, failing to protect forensic integrity. But here's the key: poor police work does not create a link between the two crimes. All it proves is systemic failure. Boulder PD mishandled more than one case, but that doesn't transform separate offenders into the same person. It only shows a pattern of negligence. Why does the video lean so heavily on this second attack? Because it provides a convenient emotional hook. Viewers hear another child in danger, same town, same year, and instinctively connect the dots. It feels right. It feels cinematic. Not because investigators missed an obvious neighborhood predator. To claim otherwise is to mistake storytelling for science and speculation for justice. If there is one element that has distorted the Ramsey case more than any other, it's not the ransom note, not the pineapple bowl, not even the grand jury drama. It's the mythology of DNA. Over the last 3 decades, DNA has been elevated in American culture from a scientific tool into a cultural icon, a shorthand for certainty. Turn on the TV, open a crime novel, scroll through YouTube thumbnails, DNA is always portrayed as the silver bullet, the final word, the irrefutable proof that strips away all doubt. This mythology didn't emerge by accident. In the 1990s, as DNA testing grew more common, news outlets latched onto it as the ultimate breakthrough. Prosecutors saw how juries responded to the magic phrase "we have DNA" and began leaning on it heavily in court. Defense attorneys, recognizing the near-hypnotic power of those 3 letters, coined the phrase the CSI effect to describe how juries expected scientific proof in every case, even when circumstances made it impossible. Within a decade, DNA had gone from complex science to pop culture shorthand. If there's DNA, the case is solved. The Ramsey case became a perfect stage for this illusion. When investigators in 2003 and again in 2008 announced that unidentified male DNA was found on JonBenet's clothing, the media immediately framed it as proof of an intruder. Headlines screamed "DNA clears the Ramses." Talk shows repeated the claim without nuance. Documentaries replayed the phrase "unknown male" as if it meant guilty man. But here's the catch: the science behind those samples was riddled with uncertainty. It wasn't a full profile. It was a degraded, partial sequence susceptible to contamination. Still, once the media packaged it as conclusive, the public heard only one thing: the parents are innocent, the killer is out there. The psychological mechanism is simple. Science carries authority. Most people don't understand allele dropout, stochastic noise, or secondary transfer. They don't know that a single brush of fabric can leave behind cells that linger indefinitely. They don't know that manufacturing workers have been found to leave DNA on brand new clothes before they ever reach a store shelf. So when they hear DNA proves, they accept it without question. The complexity is collapsed into a slogan: DNA never lies. But DNA does mislead when it's weak, when it's mishandled, or when it's oversold. And overselling is exactly what true crime media thrives on. Programs on cable TV dramatize the collection of swabs as if each one is a lightning bolt of truth. Podcasts lean on the suspense of new DNA evidence to hook listeners for another episode. YouTube creators paste mystery finally solved across their titles the moment a rumor about genealogy surfaces. In all these formats, DNA is painted not as one piece of evidence among many, but as the decisive weapon that conquers all doubt. The problem is that this portrayal collapses nuance. DNA is not binary. It isn't always yes or no, guilty or innocent. Especially in cases like JonBenet's, where the material was small, degraded, and collected in a contaminated environment. Here, DNA should have been treated as a clue requiring context, not as the definitive answer. Instead, media outlets stripped away the context and built a myth. Consider how differently the story might have evolved if reporters had explained secondary transfer the way skin cells move from one surface to another without the donor ever being present. Imagine if they had explained that partial profiles cannot uniquely identify one person. Imagine if they had told audiences that multiple unknown male samples were actually recovered from different items, not just one consistent source. The narrative would have shifted from certainty to ambiguity. But ambiguity doesn't sell. Certainty does. That's why the myth persists. It offers audiences closure, even when closure is false. It absolves families or condemns suspects with the weight of science, even when the science is far less clear. It allows networks to air specials with dramatic music and bold graphics, turning tragedy into a product. And it leaves viewers believing they've witnessed justice, when in fact they've only witnessed storytelling. In JonBenet's case, DNA has become both shield and sword. Shield for the family, wielded to deflect suspicion. Sword for storytellers, brandished to cut down competing theories. Neither use reflects the messy reality of science, and both uses perpetuate the myth that DNA is flawless. The truth is harsher. DNA can be contaminated. DNA can be misinterpreted. DNA can be nothing more than background noise picked up by sensitive machines. Without corroboration, without fibers, handwriting, behavioral evidence, timelines, it cannot stand alone. But the myth doesn't care about corroboration. The myth thrives on simplicity. DNA equals truth. And that's why it's so dangerous. In the Ramsey case, DNA hasn't brought us closer to the killer. It's dragged us further into distraction. It's allowed prosecutors, journalists, and YouTubers alike to claim certainty where none exists. It's given the public the illusion of resolution while the real mystery remains buried under layers of confusion. So when you hear DNA invoked as the final answer in JonBenet's story, remember you're not hearing science. You're hearing mythology. A mythology that comforts, entertains, and sells but does not solve. In any major investigation, especially one involving the violent death of a child, unity among law enforcement is essential. Detectives, prosecutors, forensic experts, all of them need to move in the same direction. But in Boulder, Colorado, in the winter of 1996, that unity collapsed almost immediately. From the very first hours, there was not one investigation into JonBenet's death, there were two. And those two paths pulled against each other until the entire case became tangled in politics, mistrust, and paralysis. The Boulder Police Department's instincts pointed inward. From the ransom note to the lack of forced entry, the indicators looked suspiciously domestic. The note was written on paper from the Ramsey household. The bizarre ransom amount matched John Ramsey's bonus. The phone line stayed quiet after the note appeared, and by midday on December 26th, the child's body was found in her own basement. To experienced detectives, these were glaring red flags pointing toward someone within the home. That perspective drove their early decisions. They wanted to treat the Ramseys as primary suspects, not just grieving parents. Standard homicide procedure demanded separate interviews, rigorous timelines, immediate searches of financial records, and tough questions about inconsistencies. The police believed that hesitation would only allow memories to fade and stories to be seen. They were prominent community members, wealthy, socially connected, and already under intense media glare. Treating them as culprits carried political risk. If the family proved innocent, Boulder could face a lawsuit, national embarrassment, even financial fallout. So the DA's office leaned toward protecting the family's image until irrefutable evidence emerged. Instead of assuming guilt, they assumed vulnerability. The Ramseys as victims of both a crime and a police department eager to point fingers. This posture put them on a collision course with who believed the evidence already justified suspicion. The result was a fractured investigation. On one side, Boulder PD detectives quietly built a case theory around parental involvement. On the other, the DA's office resisted moves that might tarnish the family's reputation. Instead of a coordinated effort, each side undermined the other. Take one example: Burke Ramsey, only 9 years old at the time. Detectives wanted to interview him thoroughly and quickly. Children can reveal crucial details before memories shift or adults influence their stories. Burke's DNA on the pineapple spoon and his ambiguous role that night demanded careful questioning. But the DA's office blocked early access. They argued it would traumatize him further, that he needed protection, not interrogation. By the time interviews finally occurred, months had passed. The freshness of his memory was lost, and the chance for spontaneous, unfiltered answers had evaporated. Another instance, police wanted aggressive pursuit of handwriting comparisons between Patsy Ramsey and the ransom note. This pattern repeated over and over, police pushing to investigate the family, prosecutors pulling back to shield them. The split investigation wasn't just a phrase. It was a reality lived daily by the teams supposedly working together. The consequences were devastating. While law enforcement bickered internally, evidence went stale, leads dried up, and the public narrative spun out of control. Media outlets seized on every rumor, every leak, every whisper of conflict between cops and prosecutors. Instead of presenting a united front, Boulder appeared disorganized, unsure, and defensive. This fracture gave birth to the perfect storm for misinformation. With no single coherent voice guiding the public, commentators stepped in to fill the void. Tabloids published speculation. Television specials dramatized half-truths. And eventually, DNA became fragile as it was elevated into the role of final arbiter. Because the system itself could not agree on what the evidence meant, the simplest story, DNA clears the family, became the dominant story. In other words, the failure of unity didn't just cripple the investigation. It created the opening for the mythology of DNA to take hold. If police and prosecutors had worked hand in hand, balancing forensic science with hard questioning, perhaps DNA would have remained one piece of evidence among many. Instead, the vacuum of leadership allowed it to be inflated into a shield, deflecting all suspicion. Why did this split persist? Politics. Boulder was a small city suddenly under national scrutiny. Officials feared lawsuits, reputational damage, and the wrath of wealthy donors. Going hard after the Ramseys risked making the city appear predatory. Backing off, on the other hand, allowed critics to accuse them of cowardice. Trapped between those pressures, the DA's office made choices driven less by truth and more by optics. Meanwhile, police morale suffered. Detectives who believed in their theory of family involvement felt muzzled. Some retired in frustration. Others leaked to the press, deepening the divide. What should have been confidential strategy sessions became fuel for talk shows. Every time one side spoke out of turn, the other doubled down. The case, instead of progressing, became mired in finger-pointing. This internal war had long-term consequences. The grand jury indictment in 1999 was one casualty. Jurors believed there was probable cause to charge the parents, but the DA declined to act. Why lean on weak science rather than confronting unresolved contradictions? Again, politics triumphed over collaboration. The story of Boulder's split investigation is not just a footnote. It's central to why JonBenet's case remains unsolved. Two arms of the justice system pulled in opposite directions until the case itself tore apart. Detectives suspected the family. Prosecutors protected the family. The result was paralysis. And in that paralysis, the myth of DNA as the answer grew unchecked. So when you hear a YouTube clip declare that the mystery is solved, remember the deeper reality. This was never a united hunt for truth. It was a fractured war between institutions, each more concerned with optics than with answers. And that fracture is why, nearly 3 decades later, the most haunting question remains not who killed JonBenet, but why did the system let her down so completely? When we talk about the JonBenét Ramsey case, it's impossible to avoid the role DNA has played in shaping the narrative. For years, the mention of DNA in this case has been treated like a golden key, a definitive solution that promised to unlock the mystery. From the first discovery of unidentified male DNA on JonBenet's clothing in the mid-90s, to the more recent claims of a breakthrough genealogy, DNA has been paraded as the smoking gun. But the truth, as we've already explored, is far less glamorous. DNA in this case isn't the solution, it's part of the problem. At its core, the DNA found in the Ramsey case was never as conclusive as the media would have us believe. It was, in fact, incredibly weak. When the first samples were collected in 1996, they were small, fragmented, and not suitable for high-level testing. Modern DNA analysis was still in its infancy. So what the investigators had were fragments that couldn't provide a clear picture of the perpetrator's identity. Over the years, these samples were tested and retested, but each time, the results were the same: they were incomplete, degraded, and far too weak to build a reliable profile. By 2003, technology had advanced enough to allow a better examination of the DNA. The results still showed the same thing, an unidentified male's DNA, but no match with any. It's downright dangerous. It implies that DNA can provide certainty when, in fact, it cannot. The truth is, DNA was never strong enough to make that claim. Instead, the insistence that the case is solved based on DNA alone is a product of wishful thinking and media sensationalism. Let's break this down. DNA is often treated like a definitive truth. In high-profile cases, this has become an almost mythical belief: once you get DNA, the mystery is over. But that belief is rooted more in public perception than in science. DNA can give us clues, and it can point us in directions, but it doesn't always provide a direct link to the perpetrator, especially when the samples are degraded or partial. This is where the true danger lies. The public, having been conditioned to believe that DNA is the ultimate form of evidence, starts to accept that the case is solved when, in reality, it's far from it. This isn't a scientific conclusion, it's a narrative that the media has pushed forward because it's easier to digest than the murky reality of an unsolved case. DNA may seem like the perfect tool to close a case, but in JonBenet's murder, it is anything but definitive. The investigation is still riddled with questions and inconsistencies that DNA can't answer. The ransom note, the pineapple bowl, the mishandled crime scene, all of these remain unresolved, and none of them are cleared up by DNA. The notion that the case can be solved based on DNA is a convenient fiction. We've been sold a narrative, one that serves the public's thirst for closure, but in reality, the case is still very much open. The inability to identify the perpetrator conclusively from the DNA found on JonBenet's clothing leaves us with more questions than answers. Yet, the persistent myth that DNA has solved the case does nothing but close the door on those questions. What we must acknowledge is that the case remains unresolved, and DNA has only added confusion, not clarity. It's been misused, overhyped, and distorted, turning a fragile piece of evidence into a crutch for lazy conclusions. There is no closure here, no neat resolution that we can wrap up with a bow. The reality is that JonBenet's murder is still shrouded in mystery, and we can't allow ourselves to believe that DNA has solved it just because we want to. It's important to recognize that DNA, in its proper context, is a valuable tool. But it's only a tool, not the answer. In criminal investigations, DNA can corroborate witness testimony, confirm a suspect's presence, or rule out false leads. But it's never a substitute for a thorough investigation, for logical reasoning, and for the careful weighing of all evidence. In JonBenet's case, the reliance it's the way it's been used in this case that's problematic. The over-reliance on DNA to provide a quick solution has obscured the real story of this case. And what we're left with is a string of assumptions, fueled by media hype and false hope, but not the truth. JonBenét Ramsey's case is a tragic example of how a piece of evidence, DNA, was manipulated into something it was never meant to be, a shortcut to closure. The myth of DNA as the ultimate truth continues to perpetuate itself, aided by sensationalist reporting and an eager public that desperately wants closure. But the facts don't lie. The DNA found in this case is weak, inconclusive, and has only served to muddy the waters. As we look forward, we must ask ourselves, what happens when we let myths take the place of evidence? What happens when we let convenient conclusions replace the hard work of true investigation? The JonBenet case remains open, and no amount of DNA analysis can change that. It's time we stop letting the myth of solved cases guide us, and start demanding real answers. Until we do, the mystery will remain just that, unsolved. The phrase "the mystery is finally solved" might sound like the conclusion we've all been waiting for in the case of JonBenét Ramsey. But in reality, it's a statement that oversimplifies, misguides, and perpetuates a narrative far removed from the facts. So let's stop right here and break down why this claim is not just premature, it's entirely false. One of the core tenets of justice is the concept of due process. It's a principle that demands transparency, fairness, and above all, accountability. A case is only solved when a court renders a verdict based on sound evidence. Yet here we are more than 2 decades later, still with no formal indictment, no charges filed, and no trial. If the case were truly solved, a court would have spoken. The law would have finalized it. But in reality, the legal process has never concluded in JonBenet's case. The grand jury in 1999, after hearing months of testimony and reviewing evidence, voted to indict the parents, but the district attorney, Alex Hunter, refused to sign the indictment. In 2008, DNA testing led to a brief and controversial exoneration of the Ramsey family by District Attorney Mary Lacy. But that decision has been widely criticized, and there has been no official legal closure. The absence of a legal conclusion is one of the most glaring aspects ignored in the video's narrative. Without an official verdict, one that requires a jury to examine all the evidence and render a decision, there is no case closure. So, any claim that the case is solved is simply an oversimplification. This case remains unsolved, and we are left without justice for JonBenet. Another cornerstone of the clip's argument is the DNA evidence, which is treated as the ultimate solution. But here's the issue: the DNA, though collected, has never been reliable enough to close the case. When the DNA was first discovered in 1996, it was fragmented, degraded, and too small to provide a comprehensive match. Subsequent DNA testing in 2003 and 2008 showed that the DNA found on JonBenet's clothes didn't match any of the family members. But that doesn't mean it was conclusively tied to a perpetrator outside the family. This DNA evidence, when carefully reviewed by experts, has several flaws. Size and quality: the DNA collected was not a full profile. it was a partial, degraded sample. Secondary transfer, the possibility of contamination during the collection process, or even transfer from a factory worker handling JonBenet's clothing before it ever reached her is not only plausible, it's likely. Lack of matching evidence, no suspect has been conclusively tied to this DNA, and with current technology, it's highly unlikely that we will ever get a full match. The video's claim that this DNA conclusively solves the case is misleading at best and dangerous at worst. Forensics experts have repeatedly pointed out that DNA, especially in cases with low copy numbers and contaminated samples, is not foolproof. It can mislead and create false leads, which is exactly why DNA alone cannot be the sole determining factor in solving a case as complicated as JonBenet's. So, let's be clear, there is no reliable DNA evidence that can conclusively point to the killer. The DNA found is part of the story, but it's not the answer. Despite the clip's claim of closure, we are still facing the same uncertainty that has plagued this case from the start. The mystery remains unsolved. There are too many gaps in the investigation, too many unanswered questions, and too much inconsistency for anyone to honestly claim that this case is resolved. Here's why the crime scene was mishandled from the beginning. There were major mistakes, friends, family, and police officers traipsing through the house before it was properly secured. This destroyed crucial evidence. The ransom note, a key piece of evidence that has never been explained satisfactorily. Who wrote it? Why the strange amount of $118,000? Why was there no phone call after the note was found? The family's behavior. The Ramseys, particularly John and Patsy, acted in ways that many found suspicious, resisting separate interviews, hiring lawyers quickly, and refusing to cooperate fully with the investigation. These inconsistencies remain unsolved. The presence of DNA, no matter how high-tech the analysis, cannot answer these core questions. So, to claim that the mystery has been solved because of a partial DNA sample is both misleading and premature. The truth is, JonBenet's case is still open. It may remain open for years to come, unless and until there's a real breakthrough, one that goes beyond DNA and addresses the fundamental issues in the investigation, such as the mishandled crime scene, the confusing ransom note, and the family's behavior. Until then, no clip, no media narrative, and no piece of DNA can provide closure. The bottom line is that JonBenet's case will not be solved by sensationalist clips or half-baked claims of DNA breakthroughs. It requires real forensic work, genuine investigation, and careful piecing together of every available clue. New forensic technology, such as whole genome sequencing, advanced digital crime scene reconstruction, and improved behavioral profiling, might hold the key. But we are far from the point where the case can be solved. To make real progress, investigators need to focus on the unresolved aspects of the case, rather than relying on a mythical narrative of DNA solving it all. The Ramsey family needs to be questioned thoroughly and carefully, and all angles, including the possibility of an insider being involved, must be revisited. The ransom note must be analyzed with modern forensic methods. The chaotic scene needs to be reconstructed with digital technology to better understand the sequence of events. These are the breakthroughs that will bring us closer to the truth, not sensational YouTube clips that rely on flimsy science and unfounded conclusions. Until then, the case remains unsolved. In conclusion, to say that JonBenet's case is finally solved is to disregard the complexity of the investigation and the ongoing questions that remain. The DNA evidence, while an important clue, is far from conclusive, and it certainly does not provide the resolution that the video claims. What we need is a comprehensive reinvestigation, led by professionals who understand the nuances of the case and are willing to revisit all the unanswered questions, not a rushed narrative aimed at satisfying a public desperate for closure. Until then, JonBenét Ramsey's case remains unsolved, and it could remain that way until a real breakthrough occurs, not one manufactured for clicks and views. And so, as we come to the end of this deep dive into the JonBenét Ramsey case, one thing is abundantly clear: the mystery remains unsolved. Despite the bold claims of final answers, from sensationalized clips and viral headlines, the case is still filled with questions, inconsistencies, and unanswered truths. DNA alone cannot solve it, and neither can surface-level media narratives. What we've seen is how easy it is for a complex case to become distorted when the science is misused, when the media seizes on a piece of evidence and amplifies it beyond its true significance, and when the real work of investigation is overshadowed by public desire for closure. This case, like so many others, serves as a cautionary tale. We can't let convenient conclusions replace rigorous, honest investigation. JonBenet's story deserves more than just a quick fix. It deserves the truth, the kind that comes from revisiting every detail, questioning every lead, and seeking justice for a life tragically cut short. Whether or not we get there is uncertain, but one thing is for sure: until the case officially closed, the mystery of JonBenét Ramsey remains far from solved. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the complexities of a case that continues to haunt us all. If you have thoughts or theories, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, let's keep searching for the truth, and let's never stop questioning what we're told.